I wanted to talk about three conditions that I think are necessary in order for philosophical dialogue to occur. And by philosophical dialogue, I'm referring to a specific kind of inquiry, the asking of fundamental questions about the world and the attempt to answer them through conversation. There are, of course, more than three conditions, but I wanted to limit this video to the ones that I've given the most consideration personally. With that said, I wanted to introduce the first condition through an anecdote. When I was in about 8th grade, I was visited by Jehovah's Witnesses from a local church every week. This really agreeable pair in dark suits would ring the bell around noon on the weekends, and I would invite them in for a lengthy discussion on God, the Bible, morality, and atheism. Now, while I can no longer recount the details of those conversations, I can tell you that no one left even remotely convinced of the other's position, or even understood much about why the other side held the beliefs that they did. At the time, I put that largely on the other side's stubbornness, their unwillingness to stray from a strictly biblical perspective and consider a different point of view. Whenever they came up against an argument that they couldn't counter, they said that they would reflect on it, perhaps consult someone in the church who was more knowledgeable, and get back to me the following week. And they always did. But of course, the answer was always a passage contained in the Bible, always some appeal to the absolute consistency and perfection of biblical wisdom. Eventually, I came to the realization that these interactions were never going to go beyond the citing of biblical references and the rejecting of those references. So I stopped inviting them in, and they eventually got the message, and our meetings came to an end. Reflecting on the experience immediately afterwards, I was struck by the realization that, despite also clearly seeing that progress wasn't being made, they were nevertheless ready to push on indefinitely. They couldn't understand that I needed them to first establish the Bible as a legitimate source of knowledge, and that in order to do that, they had to make an appeal to something that wasn't already contained in the Bible. They really believed that if they just kept citing passage after passage, I would eventually stop questioning the veracity of their holy book and join their church. So ultimately, it was a huge disappointment. I was left with this bewildering feeling that I hadn't even had a real dialogue. It was as if I'd been speaking to a pair of life-sized marionettes rather than flesh and blood people capable of having a spontaneous exchange with novel thoughts and reactions. However, whenever I reflect back on those interactions now, I actually feel a pleasant nostalgia because I recall how excited I was initially, especially after the first time that we sat down, excited by these people's dedication to their ideas and to persuading me of their beliefs. I'd never encountered anything like it before, because in my home and in my community, we didn't have these kinds of discussions, because Hindus by and large do not proselytize. Hinduism is recognized as a highly sectarian religion with many different and some widely diverging sects. But it's also a rather tolerant and syncretic religion. Personally, I know many Hindu households that have a statue of the Buddha, and most Hindus seem to recognize the Buddha as a great sage or enlightened being, and some even consider him to be one deity among the vast pantheon of Hindu gods. And many sects of Buddhism also recognize and worship Hindu deities. I also have fond childhood memories of myself praying and eating alongside Sikhs at temple here in New York City. But I don't recall ever feeling compelled to really reflect on the differences between Sikh and Hindu ritual or attire or beliefs. In fact, outside of official interfaith conferences, I can't even imagine lay Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, or Buddhists meeting to acknowledge or hash out their doctrinal or cultural differences. Frankly, most of us, myself included, don't even have a good enough grasp of the tenets of our faiths to engage each other in that way. And I think this is largely the result of the emphasis in the dharmic traditions on ritual, on cultivating an ethical sense and a strong sense of duty rather than on familiarity with doctrinal beliefs. In that sense, we might say that these traditions are more orthoprax than orthodox. And there is also the intellectual division of labor in these cultures, where the task of studying texts and understanding doctrine is largely left to priests, monks, and religious scholars. For these reasons, lay people rarely find themselves in a situation where they have to defend ideas or to try to persuade. And what the absence of discussion means is that people never get to concretize and flesh out the mostly vague ideas they hold in their heads, or ponder the ways that beliefs are concretized in ritual. So, while my interactions with those Jehovah's Witnesses didn't lead to any degree of clarity or understanding, they were nevertheless important as my first real confrontation over ideas, teaching me valuable lessons concerning the limits of dialogue. Immediately after the last encounter, I remember thinking hard about why the discussion was such a failure. What left the biggest impression on me was their refusal to entertain the idea that someone might not be convinced by arguments resting on the authority of a single book. Later, this got me thinking about whether I was really as undogmatic and flexible as I considered myself to be. I eventually realized that there were a lot of assumptions that I accepted unquestioningly as well, and I began to draw a parallel between how they understood themselves merely as messengers relaying the truth to how I would take out the latest issue of Scientific American or National Geographic and cite what I thought to simply be the facts. It became clear to me that we were both essentially making appeals to authority. In their case, a single text, and in my case, to an institution that I wasn't a part of. They were saying wise people wrote things a long time ago and we ought to take them seriously because they are inspired by the original cause of everything and they have real implications for our lives. I was saying science knows or has the means to acquire knowledge, and through technology it has built the world that we see around us on the basis of this knowledge. Now, it seems incorrect to equate the evidentiary claims made in science journals with the accounts of supernatural events contained in ancient books. And sure, I recognize that they are not the same, but I think the psychology behind citing either is rather similar. Both the context that the Bible was written in, as well as what happens in laboratories, the peer review process, and in my case, also the editorial process of simplifying complicated ideas found in technical literature for presentation in popular science literature, all of those things exist outside of individual experience and first-hand verification. Science is now so complex and fragmented into so many subdisciplines that you have no way of personally, empirically verifying the claims made by scientists, and it's been that way for a long time. In our technologically advanced society, the extremely high degree of specialization in the science and technology industries means that even professional scientists lack the resources, the time, or training to verify even a fraction of the staggering volume of research being generated outside of their narrow domain of work. So, given all of this, could my interactions with these missionaries be considered a philosophical exchange? Well, no, because it lacked the willingness on both sides to reflect on things that we unreflexively took to be axiomatic. We were both dogmatically clinging to our respective worldviews because they functioned as symbolic safety nets guaranteeing our utterances' veracity and meaning. Nevertheless, the experience proved to be valuable because it taught me about the futility of trying to advance dialogue in the absence of a common set of values, or recourse to a shared epistemic framework between opposing sides. So that is the first condition for dialogue. If you're unwilling to relativize your own position, examine your presuppositions, and try to come to an idea, a shared idea about what can be known and how one can go about knowing, you're just using the other person to engage in a kind of expository monologue about your own convictions or simply relaying a message. Now, the second condition has to do with the disparities of knowledge between interlocutors. So, among friends and peers, disparities of knowledge don't necessarily have to be a hindrance to dialogue. While one person may be deeply erudite about a topic and the other completely ignorant, or only have a cursory familiarity with a topic, given certain conditions, dialogue can still be productive. The ignorant person has to be humble enough to acknowledge the limits of his knowledge, but nevertheless remain willing to listen and explore both the scope and the boundaries of his intellect. The knowledgeable person has to be humble enough to acknowledge that his understanding may be flawed or partial, and that there may be value in witnessing a less informed person's first attempts to wrestle with an idea based on an understanding derived purely from lived experience as opposed to formal training or familiarity with texts. In attempting to get the other person to come to the same level of understanding, dialogue for the knowledgeable person can also be a way of learning how to teach. The third condition has to do with disparities of power between two sides. In the university, in addition to the presumed gap in knowledge between teacher and student, there's also the more detrimental asymmetry of power between these two groups. Everyone knows that it's increasingly the case that if you have the wrong politics or ideology, you are excluded from the conversations happening on college campuses. But even without political correctness as a barrier to conversation, the university as a formal institution, as an impersonal bureaucracy, is inherently incapable of establishing the conditions for philosophical dialogue. The main obstacle to dialogue in the university is the managerial authority that the professor exercises in the classroom, which is something conferred onto him by the university administration and not something that simply follows from his or her intellectual competence. The study of philosophy has nothing to do with the consequences that your academic standing can have for your life outside of the classroom, including at the extreme end expulsion due to failure to maintain academic standards, resulting in narrower job prospects, a loss of investment in time, money, and effort, etc. It doesn't just follow from the scholarly authority a professor may have on a topic that he or she should have the ability to seriously affect your life by scribbling letters on work written under unnecessary pressures. All the unnecessary pressures of school, the threat of bad grades, timed work, and now political correctness and the threat of social ostracization, what underlies all of this is the uneven power dynamic between student and teacher in the classroom. And this is problematic because philosophical dialogue presupposes the ability for both sides to inquire freely and question basic presuppositions. And in a hierarchical system that requires obedience, one side's speech in a conversation is always limited, contrived, and coerced. No matter how benevolent your professor may be, however interesting the content of a course may be, the structure of the classroom, that is, the curriculum, the syllabus, the canon of works, as well as the physical structure, the professor's desk and the students' chairs, the exams and grades, the pace at which one can work, all of these represent certain choices, and taken together, I would argue, a certain worldview that are beyond question. They are not things that emerge spontaneously or that are negotiated in a participatory manner in the way that they might be in an informal context, such as a book club organized among friends or in correspondence on the internet. So, in summary, in order for philosophical dialogue to occur, you have to be willing to acknowledge your own ignorance and potential intellectual limitations. You must grant that your interlocutor may not actually be speaking the same language that you are, that you may not consider the same things to be axiomatic truths. And when that is the case, both sides have to be willing to try to establish a common language. Then, when there's a gap in knowledge between people, as long as they are meeting freely and allowing for the possibility of blurring the lines between teacher and student, they can still meet as equals and meaningful exchange can occur. I don't think these conditions can be met by most, if any, formal institutions. Philosophical dialogue requires a certain receptivity, humility, and parity of power between parties involved. And these conditions cannot be established between an individual and an impersonal body. And that's why I think philosophical dialogue can only really take place outside of formal institutions. Thanks for listening. If you appreciate my work, please share this video with your friends and consider joining the dialogue by leaving your comments and criticisms below or by making a video response. Thanks.